All right, so we are now going to get into a different sim. So we've looked at symmetric ranges. We looked at 1, 2, and 5x stack to pot ratio. And now we're going to look at not symmetric ranges, okay? So the in position range now is what I would call condensed. This is a range that's sixes through queens. So on a relative basis, because condensed, this is condensed relative to what, right? So this is condensed relative to a more linear range. It's not a polar range, okay? This is a linear construction that starts at aces and goes all the way down to fours, okay? You could argue that in and of itself, this is linear, but it's missing the nuts, right? So it's missing the nuts and it's missing the bottom. So it's really more of a condensed range around the middle. So it's not weak and condensed, but it is, in my opinion, still condensed. So we're going to take a look at the post-flop strategy. We still have everything else is the same, so I don't really have to explain it. We've got a 1-to-1 stack to pot ratio. We've got the same board. We've got no overlaps in terms of blockers. We've got all bet sizes available to us as both in position and out of position. So the question now is really, what does the out of position strategy look like now? Okay, what does out of position do now, and what does it do differently than when it's up against a more symmetric range? How do things change now? Okay, so this is like, one of the classic situations where, like this player's range is not just limited to bluff catchers. Like, so certainly these hands have some equity, but this player's range is definitely missing the nuts, and this player's range is missing like the stone bottom. So this is like the type of situation where maybe this guy check called the turn or something, right? And if he check called the turn, he didn't check raise, maybe he doesn't have the nuts. Maybe this player does. Maybe it's a river that counterfeits some of the nuts. Who knows? But this player probably is doing some calling on a previous street, or the river changed things. That's what this type of range has done. Why would I say that? Well, this player's range, when you're missing the nuts, you don't have nut combos as often. Typically, you're not the one doing the raising. The one doing the raising and being the aggressor on the previous streets has the nuts, typically, or has the stronger range. So this player is probably the more passive player. Maybe this player got check raised on the turn. Maybe this player got check raised on the turn and called, and then gets to the river with this kind of like medium-ish range that still has some strength in it. So now, what does the out of position player do with this with this more linear construction? What should this player do with this kind of range? Okay, so you guys can pause it, put forward some thoughts about like, what do you think bet sizing wise? What do you think's going on? How does out of position behave as a better? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead now and give my own thoughts really quickly. Something that you should be able to reach as a conclusion. There's going to be shoving for sure. Okay. So there's going to be, like in this model, shoving is just 1-to-1 SPR. It's just pot. Really simple, but pot is going to be used. How do we know pot's going to be used? Because you're going to shove aces and kings a lot, for sure. So why are we going to shove aces and kings a lot? Because that's the nuts, and this player doesn't have the nuts. So aces and kings are going to be allocated towards shove fairly frequently. Bluffs like pocket fours for sure are going to be bet. We're still going to see medium strength hands checking, I would say. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of betting from like 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s. Pocket fives might get dropped into bet now because you can probably bet further down. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look, see what happens. Okay, so shoving's being used. Big shocker. Shoving's being used a lot. So you can see here the allocation to check with pocket aces has dropped. So if you just think about this comparatively, right, you can go back and watch the previous video, and I would encourage that. Aces is doing a lot less mixing, right? Aces is being allocated to alternative bet sizes a lot less often. It's either shoving or it's checking, and it's shoving a lot and it's checking a little bit, right? It's 80% jamming, 20% checking. If you go back and take a look, that's very different behavior from the nuts here than what was exhibited previously. Kings is behaving just like pocket aces. There's no difference between these two hands. And you can see that because there's no difference, they behave identically. 19.46% check, 19.46% check, the rest to jam. And like this like really, I don't know, this zero rounding error to bet 10 for whatever reason. But they behave identically. They're the same hand. Okay. Your opponent can't have kings or aces. There's no blocking effects. They're identical. So they behave identically. Queens is a dissimilar hand in that queens is tied with the nuts, right? Your opponent's range starts with queens. Keep in mind the opponent's range here is queens through sixes. We can go back and take a look. Queens through sixes. Okay. So queens is still the nuts, but it does tie with the nuts. And queens is also being allocated towards shove, 77% of the time, which is mostly very close to 80, but still not 80. So it's behaving a little bit differently. And then now what hand is being bet all the time? Jacks. So jacks is the hand that, again, your opponent does have queens. So I'm not saying that you couldn't possibly check raise what is essentially the second nuts for your opponent. Your opponent's top of range is queens. I'm not saying you couldn't possibly conceive of checking and check raising jack the second nuts here, but this hand gets a lot of value as a bet, and it's not the first nuts. So this hand is purely bet, whereas the first nuts still has this allocation to check. Okay, so that's also something to think about. This is a hand that's like, relative to your alternatives for check raising, certainly it's not the ideal candidate. It's better to check raise kings, right? Obviously, because you always win when you get called. And it's less good to check raise jacks. So you still have some of that element of like, this hand gets a lot of value betting, but I'm not sure if I want to check raise it. Maybe I should just bet it, right? Interestingly, tens is no longer using that 10% block. That's come out. That's interesting. I don't have like some automatic explanation for that behavior. Like, it's interesting. Obviously, it's blocking sometimes. It's still using a block at 14% weight, just not blocking all the time. It's also capable of betting half pot. Okay, so it's clearly like, it could it's not betting to a 30% size, but it's capable of betting to a half pot size. It's capable of betting to a 10% size. So as a human, not everything about a solver is going to be predictable for you. And as I get better over time, I'm sure more of the solver's behavior will become predictable to me, because that's been my experience so far. But you should also understand that the solver is just like another player, right? This is like, you couldn't predict, if your friend Bob was playing poker, you couldn't predict all of his actions. This is my friend Peel solver, and I can't predict everything it's going to do down to a T. That's not the point. The point is just to try to behave in a way that makes sense, and use this to try to inform some of our behavior. So the fact that this hand's not betting as often is interesting to me. I mean, like, it's something that's interesting. Like I said, I might have expected higher frequency betting, probably to a small size, like 10%, maybe 30%, but mostly 10% from pocket tens. So again, I'm surprised that the behavior is not there, but it's not like it's a big deal. Fours and fives, obviously they're the same hand now. So one of the things just to understand, just like aces and kings are the same hand, fours and fives are now the same hand. Why is that the case? Our opponent's range starts at sixes. Okay, so if our opponent's range starts at sixes, fours and fives are identical. Sixes is not identical in that it splits with pocket sixes, but it's very comparable to fours and fives. And so just like pocket queens is playing somewhat similarly to aces and kings, but not identically, so too is pocket sixes playing very similarly to fives and fours, but not identically. Keep in mind that sixes still has 0 EV in the check option. I believe, although before I check the EV, maybe it has a little bit of EV in the check option. Your opponent's bottom of range is obviously pocket sixes, right? So he's going to bluff with pocket sixes a lot, which means that when he checks, when it goes check, check, so you check sixes and he checks back, how much EV does sixes have? Probably close to 0, because your opponent's going to be pairing sixes with whatever hand he bets. If he bets queens and jacks when check to, then he's going to bluff with something, and that's going to be sixes. I mean, we know that from what we've seen so far. So sixes is the EV of sixes will be 0 if pocket six is betting all the time for in position, and it will be a very, 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 very small number if pocket sixes has a small amount of check on it. So we can go ahead and take a look at the strategy and EV of pocket sixes, and it's 0. Okay, so you can, like I said, I haven't, I'm just going through this with you guys. Like, I'm not, I could have been wrong. But these things, the important point is, A, I'm not wrong, which means B, these things are predictable. Okay, if I'm off by some huge amount, then like we have an issue. Okay, so fives and fours, EV is 0. Obviously makes sense. These hands can't win. Doesn't matter what you do with them, unless they bet, they can't win. Okay, so the reason for the comparable behavior with fives, fours, and sixes, even though sixes is technically at the bottom of your opponent's range, is that the EV of sixes is 0 if you check it, and the EV of fives and fours is also 0. So the behavior should be comparable, and it is. They serve as offsets to the larger bet sizes. Just keep in mind that at pot, so this pot sized answer here is going to be 2/3 value, 1/3 bluffs, which is why you see bigger weights in the pot size and smaller weights, right? You see bigger weights in the value bets and smaller weights in the bluffs, right? So if you just look at the check percentage is, roughly speaking, twice as high with the bluffs as it is with the value bets, even though it's 3 and 3, right? And the answer is for that is actually pretty explicable. You've got 2 value bets per bluff in a betting range if you bet pot. So that's actually exactly how it's supposed to be. So that makes some sense. Okay. And then jacks is betting to a half pot size. I think that's just a little bit noteworthy. It doesn't like betting to the pot size or jamming. You can have multiple sizings here. It's also worth noting that this pocket jack combo is basically a capped range. This half pot strategy is a capped range. There is no nuts. There's no queens. There's no kings. There's no aces. Some people have this like really hard time understanding that you can bet a capped range. Like they're like, oh, I can't bet because I'm capped. It's like, that's not true. So you have jacks, right? And when you build this half pot range as Peel Solver here, or if you just observe the way Peel Solver built it, that's a better way of saying it. If you observe the way Peel Solver built this range, it's got jacks in it. The nuts here for your opponent is pocket queens. Where's pocket queens? It doesn't exist. It's not here. There's no weighting. There's not like a 1% allocation. It's zero. You can see it's zero. These numbers are zero. So this is betting a capped range. It is betting jacks, which is the second nuts, not the nuts. That's fine. When it gets jammed on, which will inevitably happen, it will defend at a frequency, but it's still better. You're still better off betting jacks to half pot and then dealing with the jam than not betting pocket jacks, which is a very important lesson for people like you guys as they go through their career. Because like it's a lot of times like, well, if I bet and I get jammed on, then that sucks. It's like, so what? I think it's an important behavior to observe and take note of. So with that, we'll go ahead and take a look at the in position strategy now. All right, so we've now got the in position strategy facing check from the out of position player. And very quickly, I think it's important to just take note of, the behavior. Strategy is still basically barbell between check and jam. There's no small sizing choice. There's no 10%. There's no 30%. There's really very little half pot even. So out of position was using half pot much more often than in position, even though the in position's got the more capped range, which I think is somewhat counterintuitive, because I think when people say, oh, like they get shown, hey, the other guy can have aces and kings and queens, right? And then bluffs and hands in the middle. And you can only have queens. And they're like, oh, then I guess I have to bet small then. And like, it's just like the other guy's got stronger hands than me. I guess I have to bet small. It's like, nope, not true. So not necessarily true, right? So keep in mind also that in position is now up against a different range, okay? Because out of position has bet fairly often, there is a smaller allocation in the checking range to aces, kings, and queens, okay? So it's true that the opponent can have those hands, but it's not like they make up the majority of the strategy. We still see the same, approximately speaking, the same, but well, no, not approximately. We see the same bluff to value ratio, where we have two value bets shoving and then one fully weighted bluff shoving, and then we have a small fraction of sevens shoving and a small fraction of 10 shoving. So we've got a 2-to-1 bluff to value ratio. That makes sense for pot. We see we're bluffing at the bottom. We're value betting at the top. We see we're checking the middle. So that behavior is very similar. This strategy is pretty easy. There's not a lot to this. So we can go ahead and take a look at some of the versus bet strategies now. Okay, guys, we are now going to take a look at the versus bet strategy for in position. So I'm just going to, we're going to go through this together. So out of position here bets pot, and in position folds 50, calls 50. So we've gone through this math previously, but I do think it's just a quick exercise to illustrate it again. So you can just see where that math comes from and that this is totally predictable behavior. The bet is 100 over here. The total pot after the bet is 200. Pretty easy math. So this is the fold percentage we would expect. 100 over 200. Where does this fold percentage come from? It comes from the risk reward of the bettor. The bettor is risking 100 to win the total pot of what will be 200 after their bet. And if we do not defend 50% of the time, then the bluffs will generate a profit, essentially. If we folded more than that, the bluffs will generate a profit, and our opponent would continue to add bluffs incrementally until we decided to either defend this frequently or in perpetuity would just continue bluffing and relentlessly profit, which is obviously in a zero-sum game, not something you want to do. Any profits your opponents make, they make from you. So that means that you're generating losses in exchange. And similarly, if we defended more than 50%, our opponent's bluffs would generate losses, and their value bets would make more money. So they would discontinue bluffing, and their range would just be pure value, and we would be out of equilibrium, and essentially we would be generating losses that way because we would be calling with too weak a range against a range that's just value bets, and we would be destroying money in that sense. So this is the resting point or the equilibrium, and so this is also predictable. This 50% fold, it's very elegant actually. It comes out at exactly 50%. This makes it easy to illustrate. So that's great. What does that mean? Defending 50%? Well, sixes doesn't beat bluffs. Keep in mind that the opponent is actually bluffing with sixes. There's a weight on bluffing sixes here. So opponents bluffing with sixes, fives, and fours. Sixes can't win. Okay, and sevens is like the classic bluff catcher, where your opponent's bluffing with sixes and below, and value betting with aces, kings, and queens, and yeah, aces, kings, and queens. So sevens loses to the value bets and beats the bluffs. So sevens has a call at a percentage. Eights also is identical to sevens, although the call percentage is different. It's using some kind of hierarchical bias, which I don't really fully appreciate, but because the hands to me are identical, but it doesn't really matter. And you can see this like kind of hierarchical pattern. Sevens calls less than eights, eights calls more than sevens, eights calls less than nines, nines calls more than eights. And these hands are all identical again against a pot size bet. If we just look, the range is aces, kings, and queens and bluffs. So in effect, these hands are all identical hands. There's no blocking effect. So like this behavior is a bit wacky to me. Like instead of just allocating identical fractions to each hand class, but it's the way the PL solver is doing it, and I don't really care. I mean, like it doesn't matter. The important thing is that in aggregate we fold 50%, and we call 50%. We obviously defend the top of the range here. Queens, jacks, and even tens make more sense to me to be more kind of like at a higher allocation, just because they constrain how far down your opponent can bet as a shove. So if the bottom of your opponent's shoving range, for example, is jacks, and I'm not saying it is, I think it's kings, aces, kings, and queens, but if your bottom of your opponent's range is queens, then by calling with jacks instead of calling with nines, you prevent jacks from being added to the range. So that's very intuitive. But like why you would call with eights more than sevens, I don't really fully understand, which is fine. I don't have to fully understand everything. That's okay. Okay, so that's the first step of the first versus bet strategy. If our opponent bets half pot, obviously your opponent has pocket jacks a lot. We can go back and take a look at this half pot bet size here. It's jacks a lot, it's 10 sometimes, and then it's bluffs. So if our opponent bets half pot and we evaluate the versus bet answer, we see we should shove queens. We should also shove jacks, because even though jacks, we're going to run into jacks a lot, we don't run into anything better than jacks. So jacks would just jam a bunch and then get called by jacks and occasionally potentially get called by tens. Although it's not really going to be called by tens much. And if the answer to that is obvious, if it was getting called by tens, then this wouldn't be indifferent. So presumably, actually, there might even be no call with tens, and people might have a difficult time understanding. Well, if there's no call with tens, why is it shoving jacks? The answer to that question is simple: because it's break even. If the only hand your opponent can have is jacks, shoving jacks and calling with jacks is break even. So it'll do both. So I don't actually think there's any call with tens. Now that I say it out loud, I don't think there's any call with tens. I just think that this is it's break even because. Because of what I just said, it doesn't matter. And if for it to be break even, it would choose both options. So by definition, for it to choose both call and shove, it's break even to either call or shove. So there's going to be no value in the shove. Yeah, there's no value in the shove. It just doesn't matter what you do because your opponent calls with jacks and he has jacks. So the weight kind of like seeing this weight initially kind of confused me. Just seeing the weight all the way out here just made me feel like there was EV in shoving jacks, but there's not. Okay. And yeah, so we can wrap up the versus bet strategy for in position there. All right, guys, we are now going to take a quick look at the versus bet strategy for out of position. So now in position is going to make this pot size bet here, going to jam. And we're going to take a quick and clean look at the counter strategy that the out of position player should deploy. All right, so what we see here is a very high fold percentage, and a lot of viewers should correctly be saying, what happened to 50%, BBZ? Where did 50% go? And so this can be confusing for people for sure. So it's the same math, right? Opponent's betting 100, total pot's 200, 50% is the fold percentage. What gives? Why did we get 67%? And more importantly, is this predictable? The answer to that question is actually yes, which is fortunate. Otherwise, this would be a really big pain in the neck. This is predictable. It's important to understand we're defending 50% of what? We're defending 50% of the hands that can beat bluffs. Okay. What hands are those? Well, let's go back here. Those hands are sevens plus. Opponent's bluffing with sixes. Okay. So sevens plus. So we check. We look at this. That means fours doesn't count. So this 50% calculation does not include pocket fours. It is not in a careless way applied to your entire range. Okay. It is applied to the subset of hands that beat bluffs. Why is it applied only to the hands that beat bluffs? Simple. If sixes checks, it beats pocket fives and pocket fours anyways. It doesn't have to bluff to beat pocket fives and pocket fours. It can check. So those hands don't have to think about defending versus the range. They were hopeless anyways. Okay. It's only the hands that beat pocket sixes that want to make that are becoming indifferent, that like need to defend their equity in a sense, okay? That are being forced out, right? It's not fives and fours that are being forced out. It's sevens. Understand? So so sixes is the bluff. So we start counting our defending strategy up here. Okay, we start thinking about defending sevens plus, which is why you see fours, fives, sixes, and then sevens with pure fold. And as soon as you get to eights, you're mixing. Okay. Arguably, you could have had a mix with sevens, but it's bluffing with sevens. So of course, if it's bluffing with sevens, then probably not. Okay. So we start defending eights. Okay. And even sevens, and considering sevens is like a hand that your opponent's bluffing with, is somewhat ambiguous if you would want to include it in the calculation. But I would assume you would want to include it in the calculation. I'm just it's a bit like whenever you have like a hand that's like mixing like that a little bit, it's a bit more difficult to understand. But nonetheless, we certainly don't want to count fours, fives, and sixes. Okay, and to a lesser extent, I don't know if we want to fully count sevens. We probably want to count like some fractionally, 50% of a fraction of pocket sevens. I think I don't even know if we would count 50% of 100% of pocket sevens or 50% of like 80% of pocket sevens. But it's kind of immaterial. The point in terms of execution is that we defend hands that beat bluffs. Our opponent's bluffing with sixes and below. To a lesser extent, they're bluffing with sevens. Maybe we start thinking about it as we get to eights plus or something. And in that context, this higher than 50% fold percentage, as we look at this range visually, is very predictable. It's completely explicable, and it's something that we should expect. So in that regard, I think we should feel comfortable. The important lesson to draw is do not copy and paste like the 50% defense strategy across the entire range. That will lead to systematic over defending. Systematic over defending means, like, in my opinion, is something when someone's like, oh, this is how it works, this is what I should be doing, and they do it on purpose, and that's just like, that's systematic, but then it's wrong, and that's like, holy shit, that's going to be expensive. It's when you believe something is true and then the inverse of it is true, like the opposite of it is true, that's when you're in a whole hell of a lot of trouble. Okay, so understanding that like we're only going to defend 50%, the same calculation of the hands that beat bluffs, that is just that understanding is like an unlock for making sure you don't massively over defend the river. So all we really have to do is establish where our opponent's bluffing. He's bluffing at sixes. To a lesser extent, again, he's bluffing at sevens, and then start thinking about the hands that rank above that, right? In game when I'm playing, that's what I do. I'm like, where's he bluffing? And then like what hands beat those bluffs? And then I think about my range in aggregate and then try to defend it in an optimal way. Okay, so aces, kings, and queens, pure VPIP. Tens, pure VPIP. Bottom of our opponent's range is tens, so that makes sense. We're going to defend hands we're not going to fold hands that our opponent's value betting with. So tens and tens plus being pure calls makes perfect sense. And then if our opponent's bottom of range value bet is pocket tens, then of course, like we would expect mixing from nines and eights, which is exactly what we get. So like I said, I think fairly predictable. Obviously, it's a little bit more complex when we're dealing with like elevated fold percentages that go beyond 50%, but hopefully not so complex that you can't get it. And there's a very simple way to think about it that keeps your behavior very much in line with the solver's behavior, which is the kind of the goal. And like, yeah, so I'm comfortable with that. So hopefully you guys are keeping up, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.